one of the most useful things about Jung's theory is this notion of the complex, because it takes a lot of energy to keep a complex manageable and to keep half of it repressed, because half of it, if we identify with one side of the complex, and the example I always use is the victim and the persecutor. If we identify with the victim, we'll project the persecutor. And what psyche's trying to do is to get us to own some appropriate aggression. And so our ego consciousness has to grow enough to be able to tolerate arguments and differences and some appropriate assertiveness in the face of victimhood. So the reason I want to say that is that complexes have a very bad name because they're uncomfortable. We hate them. When we get into complex, we're miserable. We can't let it go for a very long time. But they are the fundamental building blocks of the personality. I had an analyst tell me one time, someday you'll be really happy to fall into complex. That day has not come yet. Okay. The way that Freud used to illustrate a repression, when there's something we can't tolerate, and it happened to us way too young for us to handle, so it gets repressed. The way Freud used to illustrate that was when he would lecture, he would have somebody burst through his door on the stage and interrupt the lecture. And then he'd have two big bullies come out of the audience and push the guy back through the door. And this would happen 2 or 3 times, and Freud would say, see, this is how repression operates. It takes a lot, it interrupts ego functioning. It takes a lot of energy to keep that thing behind the door. So I use that to illustrate why it's so helpful to work on our complexes and repressed material, because once they're resolved, it frees up energy for the ego. It's a little more free will for the ego, a little more libido. One of the most important contributions Jung made was this notion of the self. It's almost a theological notion in that it's mainly mystery, where if there be something like a self, the 2 questions: is it always there, or do we co-create it in our work with the unconscious? And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know that we can know it, because whatever this thing is, if it be such a thing, which I am convinced there is, we're inside it. Right. And it's doing things. It's needing something from us. Jung says if you work with the unconscious long enough, meaning dreams and active imaginations and journaling and just paying attention to when you get emotional, or he said if you do that long enough, you will develop an opinion about the unconscious. But more importantly, the unconscious will develop an opinion about you, which is kind of a radical notion. And so if the unconscious, if the dream comes from a higher intelligence, which I believe it does, then every dream is giving us some information. Usually we don't understand it. In my own life, I never learned 7th grade math until the 8th grade. I never learned freshman math until I was a sophomore. I learned it when I was forced to learn it for the next thing. I was always behind. And the dream seems to operate that way. It's always giving us information that we have to catch up to.